everyone. Thanks for attending today's webinar on Green Revolving Funds, or GRF. Hope you can see my screen clearly. I'm Judy Walton, AASHE's Chief Publications Officer, and I'll be facilitating the program. I'm based in Portland, Oregon. AASHE is very pleased to host this webinar with our partner SEI, or Sustainable Endowments Institute. SEI heads up the $1 Billion Green Challenge, which I'll tell you more about later on in the webinar. I was fortunate to have worked closely with Mark Orlowski and other SEI folks, along with Joe, who's the presenter today, on a guide to establishing and maintaining GRFs, which you'll hear more about from Joe. In addition, SEI and AASHE pooled our GRF data together to build a comprehensive searchable database of campus green revolving funds, which resides in AASHE's Resource Center, and which I'll also tell you more about later. We at AASHE truly appreciate SEI's support for our mission to empower higher education to lead the sustainability transformation. Toward that goal, AASHE offers a large collection of online resources and our popular weekly news digest called AASHE Bulletin. We also offer educational events, such as this webinar, and an annual conference. In fact, I'm pleased to announce that registration has just opened for our next annual conference. It's October 6th through 9th in Nashville, Tennessee. Before we begin the presentations, I'd like to go over a few important technical details. First, the webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and PowerPoint slides will be posted on AASHE's website in about a week. Check the events section. And speaking of which, I'd like to introduce a behind-the-scenes worker on this webinar, Jillian Buchholz of AASHE. Jillian will be running the technology and recording the webinar and handling any technical issues. Hey, Jillian, thank you.
You're welcome, thanks.
Another detail, as in most webinars, the audience is on mute. So the way to ask a question of the panelists or send a note to Jillian is by typing a message into the questions pane in the control panel on the right side of your screen. Even though the Q&A session is at the end of the webinar, please type in questions or comments as you think of them at any point. Only Jillian and I will see your messages. If we run out of time to answer your submitted questions during the Q&A session, you'll receive an emailed response from one or more of the panelists after the webinar. Also, it would be helpful if you identify who the question is aimed at, unless it's aimed at all presenters. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. I'm really excited to have them present, and I think you'll learn a lot from what they have to say. They'll speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. First, you'll hear from Joe Indvik at ICF International. He'll give an overview of GRFs and describe a roadmap for building successful funds. Joe advises ICF clients on sustainability strategies, including the development of green revolving funds. He graduated from Dartmouth, where he also led the establishment of a $1 million GRF as a student. After Joe, you'll hear from Susan Kidd at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. Susan has been the coordinator of her institution's GRF startup, and her talk will emphasize how critical it is to have a team of campus leaders involved from the beginning. Our final presenter is Matt O'Keefe at the University of New Hampshire. Matt manages UNH's GRF called the Energy Efficiency Fund. It has funded over $1 million worth of projects in the less than 3 years of its operation. And now I'll turn the controls over to Joe, or rather Jillian will do so, and I'll join you again after the presentations for the Q&A. Joe, are you all set out there in Washington, D.C.?
I think so. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
You need to put it on full screen. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Judy. So as Judy mentioned, I work on energy efficiency and sustainability strategy at ICF, and I've actually been working on green revolving funds for the better part of 4 years, first as a student at Dartmouth, and then as an independent consultant after that, and now as a consultant at ICF. And I'm also the lead author on the GRF implementation guide that's going to serve as the kind of basis for this talk. So I'm really excited to share with you guys some of the insights we've gained over the last 6 months or so. So our goal here is to, over the next 45 minutes or so, is to build you a practical roadmap to getting a green revolving fund off the ground. So we're going to stay away from the theoretical. We want to keep this very practical to help you manage the process for when the rubber actually hits the road. So I'm going to talk about building your GRF strategy, which includes defining what a GRF is, the anatomy of a green revolving fund, and 10 steps to building a successful GRF. And then we're going to hear from Agnes Scott and UNH, which I think provide 2 really interesting and actionable case studies on how to get this done and overcome challenges. So just to make sure we're on the same page here, let's talk real quickly about what exactly a green revolving fund is. So the traditional way, as many of you know, of making energy efficiency investments is to simply finance the project straight out of an operating budget or a capital budget. You purchase the equipment and then allow the cost savings from that equipment to just get absorbed back into the operating budget. The problem with that approach is that it treats energy efficiency as an expense and doesn't really explicitly recognize the returns that are being generated by that investment. Under a green revolving fund, on the other hand, which you can see in the diagram here, money is set aside specifically to finance energy efficiency and other sustainability projects. So that could include water conservation, waste reduction, renewable energy generation, any environmental project that also has a cost or savings or a revenue or a savings stream associated with it. But when those savings occur, instead of simply getting absorbed back into the operating budget, they are tracked and paid back into the fund, or at least a portion of them are. The savings are then used to finance future projects, and so on and so forth, which in effect creates a sort of sustainable funding cycle where you're cutting operating costs and environmental impacts by greater and greater amounts with each round of project investment and leveraging the savings from past projects to support future projects. So there's a number of advantages of green revolving funds over traditional capital investments. I think my co-panelists will talk about those a little bit, and we also go through those in the guide itself. But I think the most important advantage of a GRF is that it ultimately reframes energy efficiency as an investment rather than as an expense, right? In other words, it provides a return on investment that's concrete, measurable, and agreed upon by all parties involved up front. And that's a really powerful way to build a business case for energy efficiency. So just for some context here, green revolving funds have been growing at a very rapid rate in higher education, both in terms of the number of funds established, which you can see in the graph here, as well as the total number of dollars invested in those funds. So as of 2012, there were 76 institutions that had some sort of GRF in higher education and $111 million of capital invested, and that shows no signs of stopping. But the graph doesn't really tell the whole story. For every successful fund you see here, there's another fund that encountered significant roadblocks on the way to implementation, and probably another fund that failed outright because its proponents simply couldn't build the buy-in that they needed. So after a couple of years of working in this space, it became clear that there was a need for a guide that kind of pulls together existing knowledge about GRF and establishes some best practices. So AASHE, SEI, and ICF teamed up to publish Green Revolving Funds, an introductory guide to implementation and management, which came out a few months ago. And so the guide pulls from 4 different information sources. So first we went to existing research and data, and that includes the Grading the Bottom Line report that summarizes the state of the GRF space. We looked at case studies from successful funds, and we looked at some of the documentation like charters from successful funds as well. We did a couple of dozen interviews with stakeholders ranging from energy managers and facility managers all the way up to presidents and trustees to get their unique perspective on this. We talked to partner organizations including AASHE, Second Nature, the President's Climate Commitment, and ICS, my own company. And of course, we leveraged our own expertise in this space. So SEI's expertise in running the $1 Billion Green Challenge, my experience and my team's experience in consulting around green revolving funds, and also insights from conferences and events just like this one. So what I want to do is walk you through 2 of the chapters of this guide that I think are the most actionable for you as a potential green revolving fund proponent trying to make this happen at your institution. And the first is anatomy of a GRF. So one of the biggest hesitations we've experienced around GRFs is their complexity. They have a lot of moving parts that can fit together in complicated ways, and they often work very differently from one institution to another. So we set out to create a sort of taxonomy of green revolving funds. This would be a classification system that clearly lays out each component of a GRF and then gives you a menu of options you can choose from in designing each component. So I'm just going to briefly walk you through that taxonomy right now, and I'll use the metaphor of the GRF man. So you can imagine we can split this GRF man up into 8 anatomical parts or components that I can group into 4 different categories. So the first is the foundation of the fund, or its seed capital source. The most common sources of seed capital for a GRF are operating budgets and capital budgets, just like traditional energy efficiency investments. But there's a variety of other potential sources as well, and those include investing directly out of the endowment, charging a student fee to generate some funding, attracting alumni donations, the list goes on and on. So there's a lot of flexibility in how to seed a fund, and we've seen institutions have success across a wide range of funding options. The second is the legs of the fund, or its operations. So that includes the process that's used to select projects in the first place for financing, and that can be a competitive process or a non-competitive process depending on how you want to run it. And it also includes the criteria that are used to assess those projects. So common criteria include payback period, capital cost, specific environmental benefits, as well as the degree to which the project promotes engagement from the broader campus community. And then we have the inner workings, or the guts of the fund. So this refers to the accounting system, or how money actually moves back and forth from various accounts within the institution to support the fund. And repayment mechanics are also flexible. So some funds require only a portion of annual savings to be repaid back to the fund, which makes the project cash flow positive right away for the project recipient. And other funds actually charge interest on those repayments, which allows the fund to grow organically over time. So there's quite a bit of flexibility in designing that component as well. And then, of course, the method used to determine those repayments is important. So some schools use a very rigorous empirical measurement and verification process where they actually carefully track the savings that are materializing once the project is implemented, and they use those to determine repayments. Other schools simply estimate the savings up front, and they don't do any empirical verification that those savings are really materializing. They simply get all parties to agree on the repayments up front. And then, of course, we have the leadership of the fund, and fund oversight refers to who actually manages the day-to-day operations. Most commonly, this is a committee drawn from stakeholders throughout the institution who have some relationship or are going to be impacted by the fund in some way. But some funds are also run directly out of a facilities, finance, or sustainability office. And then one of the often overlooked attributes of GRF is how they fit into the long-term strategy of your institution. In other words, how they can sort of support and complement existing initiatives like climate action plans, capital plans, or strategic sustainability plans. So that's a very high-level overview. I wish I could get into more detail, but check out the guide if you'd like more discussion on each of those components. But and that was sort of the descriptive part of the presentation. I really want to move into the prescriptive part, which is 10 steps to a successful green revolving fund. So the other hesitation we encountered from folks trying to set these up was that they simply didn't know where to start. They needed someone to lay out a process to help them think through how to design each of those components and kind of get the wheels turning. So that's what we built. And I'm going to sound a little bit bossy for the next 5 minutes or so, but these ideas are not coming just from our team, but they're coming from a couple of dozen different stakeholders who have done this successfully and had a lot to say about some lessons that they've learned. So I think these are some useful facts. So here's the 10 steps. I'm just going to briefly walk you through each one. Step number 1 is do your homework. I think this is probably the most important step, in my opinion. I think this quote from John Onderdog sums it up, but he says, don't reinvent the wheel. Talk to other universities who have made this work and assimilate those programs into a custom program that will work at your school. So before you do anything, drop everything and go to www.greenbillion.org/resources. There you can find, among other things, the Greening the Bottom Line 2012 report, which, as I said, summarizes the state of all known green revolving funds in higher education. You'll find an investment primer that discusses the pros and cons of different seed capital sources. You'll find case studies from successful funds. And of course, you'll find this guide as well as all future iterations of the guide. So I remember when I was leading the proposal team back at Dartmouth to establish our GRF, we had a pretty lengthy proposal process because we had to work through each of the components of the fund, which is a fairly complex one as GRFs go. And it took us a good long while to get that proposal in place. And I'm convinced that if we'd had these resources at our disposal back in 2010, we could have probably shaved half the time off of that process. So I recommend you save yourself the pain and make sure that if you have a question, that question has not already been answered. Step number 2 is select your model. So once you've done your homework, it's time to select a basic approach to how your fund is going to work. That might change later. In fact, it will and probably should change later as you shop the idea around with stakeholders, but at least this will give you a starting point and end point for discussion. So as I like to say at this step, GRFs are a lot like snowflakes. No two funds are exactly alike. So there's this common misconception that GRFs are a sort of predefined entity that you can just adopt wholesale the way somebody else is doing it and expect it to work perfectly. In reality, we find that the best GRFs emerge out of the way that your organization is already doing business. So for example, the fund should take advantage of your current accounting structure and shouldn't disrupt it too much. It should fit into the current job responsibilities of your staff, and it should be built around the project portfolio that you know is available for you. So the most successful funds are often also the most innovative because they are tailored to the unique characteristics of their home institution. And we also advise that early in the process, it's a good idea to start running the numbers to get some idea of how the fund as a whole is going to perform. So that usually has 3 key steps. And many of you will be familiar with this, but I just want to kind of formalize this process. The first is, of course, energy audit. So you have to have an understanding of what projects are available available to be financed in the first place. If you don't have a clear idea of this, it's a good idea to conduct an energy audit, either internally with your facilities staff or energy management staff, or by bringing in outside contractors. And then once you've done that, it really pays to kind of pile all those opportunities into a single opportunity list along with the costs and savings associated with each. So this is going to provide a sort of menu of options that your GRF can choose from when it begins operating. And many schools actually take this a step further to analyze how the portfolio of GRF projects as a whole is going to perform. So that entails selecting whatever subset of projects you think will constitute the first couple of rounds of GRF investment, and then model out its performance in terms of return on investment, net present value, total carbon mitigation, or whatever quantitative metrics that you care about most. So that's certainly going to help you build the business case for the fund for any folks you haven't won over yet, but it's also going to help you make sure you design the fund in a way that maximizes the metrics that you care about. Steps number 4 and 5, I'm not going to say too much about those. We're going to let Susan and Matt talk about those in more detail in a little bit. Step number 6 is establish financial flows. So I considered putting a skull and crossbones as a visual aid here, but thought better of it. This is probably the most overlooked and the most dangerous step of this process. So financial flows refers to how money actually moves around within the institution. And so the problem with this is that many institutions at this stage in the process run into significant barriers, and some of them fail altogether because they simply can't figure out how to make this work. So I can't necessarily answer all the questions you might have about this because every institution is so different in terms of its accounting structure, but there are some make or break questions you can ask early in the process that will help kind of grease the wheels. So the first is, who's actually going to pay the project invoice and what account are they going to use to do that? So in other words, who's going to have ultimate ownership over the project? Number 2 is, what account is going to be used to make repayments? How often are those repayments going to occur, and what size will they be? How many dollars are we talking about here? And importantly, what method is going to be used to determine those repayments in a way that all stakeholders can agree upon and won't create any rifts politically? And then another third and often overlooked point is, how are these transactions and obligations going to appear on the departmental balance sheets? So if a department takes on financing from the GRF, is it going to appear as debt on their balance sheet? And if so, are there any policies or procedures in place that prevent or discourage the acquisition of debt? If there are, can you think of any creative ways around that problem by reclassifying GRF financing? So these are all very nitty-gritty, in-the-weed questions, but if you can answer them early in the process, it's going to save you a lot of pain later on. Step number 7 is launch the fund. I'll leave this one to Matt to discuss in detail, but I would just say that never waste a good opportunity for publicity. Everybody loves big checks like this one, and one of the greatest strengths that green revolving funds have is that, unlike traditional capital investments, they actually represent an opportunity to bring students, staff, faculty, administrators, and everybody else to the table to collectively make decisions about sustainability. Right? People can actually participate in a green revolving fund, either by applying for financing or helping to manage the funds on the committee. So there's no better time to start encouraging that kind of engagement than at the fund launch itself. Step number 8 is implement projects. I'll let Matt cover that one in much more detail. He has far more expertise in that area than I do. Step number 9 is assess performance. So I can't reinforce enough the importance of having a standardized system for quantitatively tracking the performance of your fund. So I've talked to many fund managers who have project data coming from one project in a certain spreadsheet format and project data coming from another project in a wildly different format, or maybe in a Word document or God forbid, a PDF. And it makes it very difficult to kind of synthesize that all together into a consistent quantitative framework that allows you to analyze how the fund as a whole is performing. So SEI actually built the Green Revolving Investment Tracking System, which you can see a screenshot of here, specifically to meet that need. So this is a web tool that's available to participants in the $1 Billion Green Challenge, and it's going to allow you to track project-level performance data, of course, but then it's going to also allow you to analyze the performance of your fund as a whole, and then share that information with other institutions and receive shared information, provided that you're willing to, in order to learn from what other folks have been up to. But even if you don't use GRITs, having some sort of consistent way of tracking this data is crucial. It's going to help you continue to justify the fund's existence by being able to show quantitative metrics, and also going to help you tailor the fund over time. And speaking of improvements over time, my one last point is that most of the successful funds have some sort of a regular review process in which they evaluate their performance, they change the way that they operate, perhaps they pull more stakeholders onto the management committee, they do whatever they need to do to keep the fund operating smoothly. In some cases, for example, a fund might eat up all the low-hanging fruit at an institution. This isn't always a problem, but sometimes it is. And so if all the low-hanging fruit is gone, you may need to relax your payback requirements or allow the fund to expand to different project types or something like that. So that does it for the 10 steps. Take a look at the guide online on the resources section of the $1 Billion Green Challenge website if you want, or also feel free to shoot me an email directly. You'll see my contact info at the end. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan and Agnes Scott, who's been doing some incredible stuff with their GRF. So take it away, Susan.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate being asked, and Agnes Scott College appreciates being asked to participate in this webinar today. I want to make 2 points as I start to kind of relate to the audience that we are beginners at this, so we're probably more in the same place that a lot of you listening are. We have gotten started. We have done our first project, and we're moving toward a second, third, and a longer list of projects now, but we are at the beginning. And also we're doing this on a small college campus. Briefly about Agnes Scott, we're located in Decatur, Georgia, which is a incorporated area within the metro Atlanta area, so just a few miles from downtown Atlanta, but sort of more like a small town. The Agnes Scott was founded in 1889 as a small liberal arts college for women, which we continue to be today. Our population numbers, of course, like all of yours, vary a bit, but this year we're a little over 900 students and about 300 faculty and staff. The physical footprint of the college, we have 29 buildings, a little less than 1 million square feet of usable space. We're on a 100-acre, rather large campus for an urban setting with 2,000 trees. So we are an arboretum as well as a Tree Campus USA college, and I mentioned that partly as just sort of a connection that we have a lot of different aspects of sustainability going on simultaneously at the college. So the Green Revolving Fund is a piece of a sort of larger sustainability puzzle. And speaking of that, since I'm to emphasize the building buy-in and securing seed funding, but I'll also sort of refer back to steps 1 through 3, your homework, selecting your model, and running the numbers, because for us, actually, all those first 4 steps have sort of worked simultaneously, and that we've had a step of building buy-in that's really been a consistent right along since really having the idea to do a green revolving fund. And I think we see that as a real lesson learned, that we needed to build a foundation of sustainability on campus first and then move to something as technically and financially complicated as a green revolving fund. So we've had several years of building a sustainability program, both academically and operationally. You'll see on this slide that sustainability is seen by the college leadership as part of our strategic planning process. Our general mission statement about educating women includes a point of living honorably, and sustainability in our strategic plan is tied directly to the goal 4 of living honorably. So we have this basis that we're working from together and seeing the college move ahead across all areas, but sustainability being woven into that. So why did we even consider starting a green revolving fund? Really, the number 1 reason was after doing our homework part, we began to realize that that we really weren't finding a financing mechanism that fit us well. So we really were not inclined toward performance contracting. The college was trying to avoid very much extra new debt, so conventional loan financing or even bond financing didn't appeal to us. And we also were really intrigued at the idea of capturing our own savings. And one of the things we've tried to do on campus, which I'm sure a lot of you also at small colleges can relate to, is trying to do as much as we can ourselves on our own with our own resources of staff, faculty, and of course students. And so the revolving fund was really appealing to us because we could sort of do it ourselves. And that kind of leads to the next point, and this is a quote that our president uses a lot when she talks about the Green Revolving Fund. She always calls it an elegant vehicle for structuring and highlighting the institutional commitment to efficiency. So we really were looking for a way not just to fund projects, but to show a commitment. And that commitment is multifaceted. I just mentioned two things on this slide: the carbon emissions reductions, of course, which we're a signatory of the President's climate commitment, so we have a target for being climate neutral by 2037, so we're very daily conscious of that, but also, like all of you, are looking for all the ways we can have budget savings related to sustainability, and of course this could give us a significant utility budget savings over time. And then we, as we were considering this, realized its potential for you know, as a liberal arts college, we're always looking for ways to incorporate what we do into the classroom, so we knew this was an interdisciplinary tool. Some subjects mentioned on the slide, but also for a variety of other subjects that we teach here. And initially faculty and student interns are involved with the fund in a lot of ways, but we hope eventually to even incorporate it into the classroom. And then we began to see early on, just when we were sort of talking about this concept with some individual donors and one foundation, that we were getting a really positive donor response. So we knew that we'd hit on something that was favorable internally as well as outside the college, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So for us, building buy-in, that important step 4 in the handbook, it has really had its own several steps. So we started out by, and this is back to the running the numbers, we did our analysis of all our energy retrofitting needs, came out of that with a ranked priorities list. We also knew we wanted to set up an energy conservation program, a behavioral change program, so that we could, you know, we were practicing what we were preaching, meaning the whole community being the we. And so you'll see two things on this slide: a poster from a campaign we did 2 years ago, which we continue annually to direct our college community toward more energy conservation behaviors. And then we also have a building dashboard, the screenshot on the bottom of the slide, which allows us to have both real-time monitoring of 15 of our 29 buildings that's visible on 2 monitors on campus, but all the time on a web, at a web site. But also it has a module to do competitions. So competitions have been part of our conservation programmatic approach. We also spent our early buy-in and research time focusing on our best practices for tracking or utility monitoring, came up with a solution for that for us, and then we got support from a donor. Actually, at this stage, we had a very small grant from an individual donor to pay for the things on this slide, basically the internship and the utility tracking consultant. So we even had startup funds before the fund itself was established. We always made a point of covering everything in the college's publications, so that by the time we started approaching alums for funding for this, they were aware of our overall sustainability efforts, so that they were sort of briefed before our development team would make visits. And then we can't underscore enough the help of both AASHE. It was at AASHE conferences that we got our first information about green revolving funds, and of course from the Sustainable Endowments Institute. And the challenge, things that they've done before now leading up to this current handbook have been so helpful to us, as have a lot of other colleges. For us, Caltech was a huge help. So thanks to all of those folks, but that homework was very important. So the next step was we had all the information on the table now, including what green revolving funds are and how they could be used here, but we needed to really convince ourselves, quite honestly. And so we started, as the Director of Sustainability, I was really the coordinator, as Judy mentioned, but I have frequent meetings with our President and our Vice President for Business and Finance, and he is in that photo you're seeing. He's on the far left, and our President's happily holding our Tree Campus USA plaque. They have been really in every conversation. I mean, I would sort of literally come back from the AASHE conference and tell them what I'd learned, and we've sat down with trustees and talked it through, our Sustainability Steering Committee, just to try to get a sense of comfort and understanding. And we always had students doing research for us. We had one student who did a quick survey with some of the smaller colleges that had revolving funds early on, so we would understand better what they had gone through. So as Judy said in the introduction, I can't emphasize enough that we here at Agnes Scott really see this as the success we've had is because of really open communication and open conversation about how we were going to approach the fund. So almost a week didn't go by that I wasn't having a conversation with one of those players. And then we got to sort of the most recent step in the building buy-in, which was mentioned in the handbook discussion by Joe, which is to set up how we're going to run the fund. And so we involved the president actually appointed the committee with the VP for Business and Finance as the chair. We have facilities staff, information technology staff, sustainability staff, several other staff members, 3 faculty members, and 2 students on the committee. And they help shape our guidelines, which are now published on the SEI website along with some others, and including the criteria. And the staff, we had come up with the initial criteria and that we used to weight our priorities list of the payback period, the operational urgency, and the carbon reduction. But the committee started adding other things that have been really made for much more interesting conversations when we've looked at projects to approve, like visibility, educational value, and other positive spin-offs for students, faculty, and staff that might not be pure utility savings or even carbon reduction. So the buy-in has continued, and we think will continue on. So, in the last point that I'm to talk about is critical, I think, for all of us and has been for us, and that's the securing of seed capital. So what, again, our president likes to say is one of the reasons Agnes Scott has tried to stay on top of the national trends and join in and be a charter signatory, including of the Green Challenge, is that it gives us a target. So we were recruited and decided to join the challenge and committed to have that $1 million target that you see. That started us down a path of both designing the fund itself, but then looking for support. So we've been really fortunate that working with the fundraising office, the development office, the sustainability office, and our president, we've been able to raise a commitments of almost $400,000, all from individual donors, most of whom are alums, but we have one who is not. And we now have 2 requests pending for $60,000. Those are both with foundations, actually. And then we expect our future sources we hope to include more foundation support, our building renovation funds, meaning that when we're fundraising, we're in a comprehensive campaign that includes capital projects. And when we put together a capital request for a building, we're including revolving fund requests within that, so that we're thinking on the building specific level in fundraising requests. We will be using some what we call deferred maintenance funds, or some people would just say operating budget or capital budget. We expect to use some office operation money, but actually we're trying to only do that in instances where it's a project that what we usually say is we would be doing it anyway. And so that upfront cost of operations will be funded by the operations budget. But then if there's sort of a sustainability premium, if that project was going to be done at a minimal level of efficiency, but we can bump it up a notch, then that project could come before the Green Revolving Fund to pay that difference. So we expect those to be the only operations funds we'd be using. And then last but not least, obviously the reason we set this up under this type of umbrella fund is because we will be revolving the utility savings back into the fund along with the donor support. And we are committed to, at the outset at least, we are revolving 100% of the projected savings for the project payback period to the fund. And there were 3 or 4 specific items in that statement, but I'll save any further information on those for the question and answer period. So I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Susan. My name is Matt O'Keefe. I'm the Campus Energy Manager at University of New Hampshire. And we'll tell a little story here. My screen's been taken over. Okay, sorry. So this will give a little history on how we run our fund. We call the Energy Efficiency Fund, or EEF, and we began in 2009. And the accounting methodology that we have here on our campus is one called an RCM campus, where we basically have all overhead costs being bundled together so that our utilities roll in with all the other overhead costs like housekeeping costs and other types of overhead labor. And that then gets billed out to campus departments and colleges through a watered down $ per square foot rate. So the downside of that is that even though we might meter and quantify all the utilities being consumed at all of these buildings, it's really not an incentive for the campus to do any conservation because they don't see it. If one building does a good job of conserving, it doesn't matter. It's so watered down by the time it gets to the rest of the campus, so there's no incentive there. So that, plus the fact that we set our budget a good year in advance before any actual expenditures occur, makes it very difficult to try and account for this. So basically, if we set our budget and utilities cost more than what we had planned, there's no way for us to collect that back from the campus entities. So if we have to under-collect from the campus, our department and our operating budget actually eats those costs. So it's kind of a difficult situation for us. So it really puts the onus on any type of energy efficiency or conservation on the facilities department, and specifically our energy department within that. So our model looks at a different way than other campuses as far as trying to set up the model for capturing those costs and then charging it to the campus. So we set up what we call kind of a systems benefit model, which really mimics what a lot of the local utilities do with some of their incentive programs. Basically, they're putting a slight adder to each unit of energy that's being consumed, and that then gets bundled together and then becomes a fund that people are able to borrow against for certain measures. So what we do with that funding is we try to invest in energy efficiency projects targeting about a 5-year simple payback, and that allows us to maintain a portfolio of projects that are both short and long term. We estimate the energy savings using the standard measurement and verification protocol, and we usually start with estimated savings, usually engineered estimates when we start a project, because we have to set that budget so far in advance. And then after we start to actually see the savings as we're going year after year with the actual project, we'll start to reconcile with our operating budget based on the metering that we have installed as part of the project. That allows us to monetize the savings through that systems benefit charge, and we build that into the rate that we charge our campus units. It totals then into one line item that we use for the next budget cycle. We reinvest all those savings into additional projects, and it's managed on day-to-day operations through our facilities office. Our energy office is underneath that. And then we propose projects through what we call our Campus Energy Task Force. And this, like Susan had mentioned, is a group made up of both faculty and staff and students, and it allows all the stakeholders to really have a say in what we're trying to accomplish as far as energy projects on campus. We use our climate action plan, which lists our greenhouse gas emission targets. So this has really become the document that we use to list future projects and all the goals that we wish to accomplish with our Energy Efficiency Fund. Our forecasted cash flows looks at basically when we started the fund, which was just a few years ago, and we were able to start with using our systems benefit charge. We also then, once we had the methodology in place, were able to incorporate that for outside funding. We just happened to be coming online right as the stimulus money was starting to be handed out for various efficiency projects throughout the country. So this seemed like a good vehicle to say not only are we investing in projects that are shovel ready that they were looking for at the time, but also that the investment would then be rolled into additional projects for the future. Excuse me. The cash flows show how we slowly build the fund. So as you start to have additional projects year after year, we're looking at the cumulative lifetime savings of the projects. You're not just seeing, 1 year's annual cash flows coming in from that, but it starts to accumulate. And then it starts to settle out when you start to have the older projects starting to retire. So we're not going to collect savings from a project that only has a 5 or 7 year lifetime, like something like a lighting upgrade. Typically there'll be a designated horizon on when those savings should be collected, and that's when we'll start to stop collecting those savings and then look for the next crop of projects to take over. The early success of the fund led to a one-time infusion of capital funding in our 3rd year, and basically we have renewable energy certificates from a renewable project that we have completed in the past few years, and showing the success of the fund allowed an easy vehicle for them to invigorate the fund with some more funds that allows us to really get to our target level that we have sought to try and get on an annual basis, which is about $500,000 a year. And that target really is set to match what our forecasted annual investment we think should be, as well as a level that is considered doable from an operating budget perspective. You don't want to try to achieve an annual operating budget that is going to be so high that at some point your budget committee will say, listen, we can't afford to continually invest this amount of money. So it needs to be something that's realistic and that that you can attain savings on an annual basis. Like I said, the ability to leverage savings of the future investments makes incentive and grant programs a lot more attractive. This year alone, we're going to get over $400,000 in outside grant and incentive money, and a lot of it was because we could illustrate the fact that you're not only investing in this one-time project, but actually a system of projects over the next 10+ years. The initial investment and additional funding from this year alone, so about that $1 million, will yield over $4 million by 2020. So it's really impressive when you can say that this is going to be leveraged with other projects in the future. Our goal was to flatline the campus energy intensity. So over the past 10 years, we've historically grown by about 4% per year in energy consumption per square foot. So our goal was to just try to get that to a level that we can maintain the same energy intensity. What we're seeing from this current fiscal year, that we expect to not only maintain that energy intensity level from last year, but actually start to see it decline. So we're actually outperforming what we thought that we could do at this point. Like Jill mentioned, really the way to show folks that it's a true and transparent process is to track all the savings that you are getting from these projects. So to truly recover all the costs associated with our energy efficiency fund, the savings must be captured through metering or some type of prescriptive savings report. Joe had mentioned the GRIT software that is put out by the Sustainable Endowments Institute. So we're starting to use that for some of our accounting as well. There's other software programs that exist out there. There's a new Department of Energy pilot called the Asset Score that's starting to look at building energy performance. So there's a lot of vehicles that can be used to try and at least set benchmarks for the building performance now, and then to look at how you can start to see performance going forward. The energy cost savings that we collect, they have to be reconciled because of our budgeting cycle. So we actually look at the performance of a project, and if it overperforms or underperforms, we'll reconcile that with our next year's budget. So in the case of our fund, we actually had a large lighting project that didn't get the type of savings that we had originally estimated because of various reasons, but we went in and actually had to reduce the amount of annual savings associated with that project, and that was then taken into account when we looked at the next year's budgeting cycle for the fund. And you can also use published reports that are out there that have a lot more real-world data. So there's a lot of different evaluation reports that utilities use on similar types of efficiency projects that you can have access to. And I think what will be very helpful is this new GRIT software that Joe mentioned. Also will have that project database that you'll be able to reference other schools that are doing similar projects. So you can see if a lighting project at a similar campus was a 5-year lifetime or was it a 10-year lifetime. You can kind of look at some of those real-world examples to determine some of the inputs that you need for tracking. Once the fund is up and running, the outside investment piece, either grants or donors, like Susan mentioned, they're a lot more attractive because that dollar invested will be compounded into the future projects through the life of the fund. So if you can use that documented data that shows what an outside investment will yield, and typically, like our fund so far, an outside dollar invested is about 4 times, worth that by the time the entire fund is run its life cycle. That really bolsters the argument for funding. So it's a lot more compelling to get that type of investment than just investing one time in one singular project expense. So I think that that's really the argument for having some type of green revolving fund, is that you can really expand upon the total lifetime savings of these types of projects. All right, now Judy will tell you all about some of the resources available from SEI as well as the AASHE before our Q&A.
Thank you, Matt. That was an excellent presentation, as were Susan's and Joe's, and I'm looking forward to some great Q&A. But before we get started on that, I'd like to share a few resources that might be helpful for audience members. First, we wanted to let you know that this spring, SEI plans to release an even more detailed and comprehensive GRF implementation guide. The new guide will include full case studies on specific fund design components, such as project selection or accounting, and guidance on M&V, or measurement and verification. And it'll also include a section on fund-related analytics and resources, such as charters for compiling fund documentation, and just generally more content and more examples. So keep an eye on www.greenbillion.org/resources this spring. And the GRF guides are part of the $1 Billion Green Challenge, which I mentioned at the start of the webinar. If you join the challenge, your institution commits to setting up a GRF and gains access to resources such as the Green Revolving Investment Tracking System, or GRITS, that Joe and Matt just mentioned. And you also get access to networks of peer institutions and tons of support from SEI. Follow the link on this page to learn more about that challenge and to sign up. I also wanted to remind you of another resource I mentioned in the intro, the searchable database of all campus GRFs, at least those we know about. If yours isn't in here, let us know. You can find this public database in AASHE's Resource Center at the link on this page. Here's an image of what it looks like, and just look for the investment and financing link on the landing page. And finally, here are a couple of upcoming AASHE events that we thought might interest you. The first is a webinar on integrating sustainability into the curriculum on May 28th. And the second is a first-of-its-kind workshop on developing a campus sustainability living lab in June here in Portland, Oregon, where I live. You can go to aashe.org/events for more information on either event. And now let's move into the Q&A session in the remaining 5 or so minutes. The page on your screen includes instructions for submitting questions, as well as photos and names of presenters to help you identify who your question is for. Please do include the name to who the question is aimed at, unless it's for all the panelists. Also, if you want to follow up with any of us after the webinar, just jot down our phone number or email address, and we're all happy to answer any questions. So the panelists, you feel free to take yourselves off mute. You can all join in answering the questions. We've got a few coming in now, actually. There's a question here for Joe. You mentioned that the guide was created by studying successful funds. How did your team define success for a green revolving fund?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't have any particular formal definition. We tried to talk to some of the funds out there that have been operating for several years. If you look at that graph of GRF implementation, you'll see that about half of them have been implemented in the last 2 or 3 years. So there's not a lot of experience out there, but there are a few funds that have done this, been doing this for a long time, and have managed to kind of maintain a high return on investment over the course of that time. So Harvard's one good example. Western Michigan's another good example. So we focused on those folks because they've had many years of experience in managing these things. But we also tried to talk to people who recently implemented the funds to get their insights on on how to build buy-in and go through that process too. So we looked at a mix of old and new funds.
Thank you. This next question is for Susan or Matt. Why don't we have Susan go first, and then Matt, if you want to jump in. Can GRFs be utilized in conjunction with performance contracting or ESCOs, or are they mutually exclusive?
I have a master's degree in environmental law, so I can't answer that from a sort of legalistic perspective or a technical, as a technical advisor. I can answer it from our decision-making perspective, which is that we felt like, at least at this point in time for our college, it was one or the other, and so we chose the Green Revolving Fund. I think you could have an aspect of your efficiency work under performance contracting and still do other projects with a Green Revolving Fund. But I guess what I would encourage is to really think hard about both options and the timing and the fit for your project list. Whether you're going to mix the two or do one or the other exclusively, they definitely have differences in terms of why you would choose them. So, and I'll say our number one reason for choosing the Green Revolving Fund at this point in time for us was that we wanted to capture the savings ourselves and revolve those savings back into other projects on our own, and we were willing to take the upfront risk on having the upfront investment dollars, which an ESCO could bring to the table by doing the fundraising. So that's how we sort of created that option for ourselves.
Yeah, I would just add to that that I definitely think the model could exist where you use a performance contract, with an outside company to identify the projects that you want to achieve over a certain time period, and you can either through the typical performance contract methodologies, whether it be shared savings or guaranteed savings, that you can use whatever that savings is that the campus will achieve and either have it go into an annual fund that can start to build the beginning of your revolving fund, or have it be, as the length of the term with the performance contract ends, that anything that's still considered achievable savings beyond that period goes into building the fund after the performance contract ends. So I think that there's definitely some wiggle room with a typical performance contract, but if you don't have the in-house staff to really keep an eye on doing any of the measurement and verification, you almost need to go to a third party. So it's just a matter of how do you define that contract with that third party.
Thank you. Joe, did you want to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, I would just quickly add that we advise many clients on that very question, and if it's a complicated question, I don't think there's a clear answer on whether to go with a performance contract or a GRF or both. I think the two main advantages of performance contracts are that usually they come with third-party capital. So if you're capital starved, often going to an energy service performance contract is the way to go. Also, if you don't have the in-house capabilities, as Matt just said, to do measurement verification or to manage that process, ESCOs have the advantage of being kind of a hands-off process. But generally, I would say if you know the business case for efficiency is there, you know what your projects are going to be, you have liquid capital that's available to flow into those projects, more often than not, a green revolving fund is going to be the way to go. But it is a complicated question.
We have another question for Matt. What are some examples of green projects that UNH is looking to invest in over the forecasted time period using the sustained cash flow?
We've got 11 projects that are either completed or the process of completion, and like I mentioned, we're trying to do a broad range of projects, both short and long term, to find various technologies that we want to use elsewhere. So we've got one project that is a demand control ventilation project in a lab space that allows us to reduce overall air changes so we don't have to heat and cool that ventilation air as much as we would without it. And we use that as a test site for us that we're planning to expand that same technology elsewhere. And that is a very quick payback project where we have a long-term project, which is a renewable project. It's a solar preheating system which uses sun's energy to preheat the ventilation air for another lab space. And that actually has a much longer payback, but the measure life for the system is 20+ years. So we're trying to get different examples of various projects out there that we know that we want to actually use elsewhere on campus. We're also doing a lot of retro commissioning of late because we're finding that that's a very underserved project and program that has a lot of payback for us.
Okay, thank you. We have time now just for probably one more quick question, and there is one probably for anyone who would like to answer it, maybe starting with Susan, Matt, and then Joe. What's your recommended answer to an objection to a GRF that our institute is already making good sustainable investments and doesn't need this formalism?
Well, I guess that would be where the point of view here is that we didn't propose it without bringing up the concept at the folks who might have said that to us. We were sort of asking, did they think that was a good idea? And then if they had a challenging question, you know, like, well, we could already do it, our staff and our interns would go back and say, you know, but could we do it better, differently, you know, longer or longer term or quicker startup? You know, what would be our sort of way of responding to that? So we would always kind of analyze any concern or negative response and see if we could come back with another positive response. But I think it's you know, to take it at a concept level and put it to the side. I mean, unless they're right, which they must not be, if you're interested in pursuing the Green Revolving Fund, you know, I think you can probably find a way to argue back graciously, that there are things this could do that you're not doing at the moment.
Matt or Joe, anything to add to that?
Sure. What I would add to that is having a green revolving fund is almost having this commitment that you're going to have a certain amount of expenditures on efficiency projects year after year. We had an old format, which is probably the most standard at most campuses, where you might have a line item in your budget that says you're going to spend this amount of money every year on, you know, efficiency type projects, and it's going to be the same amount every year, and spend it or lose it. Well, this allows you to have a fund where you might see a very expensive project in 1 year, so you don't spend anything from your cash flows in a year or two, so you can build up the capital to spend it on that larger long-term project, you know, in a year or two. But it also, I think my biggest argument for them is just the leveraging of funds. You know, so if you know that you're going to be spending all the savings generated from this project, it's going to be, you know, a lot more invested over time. And when you can show those leverage funds to outside people, you know, donors, or to the folks that typically give grants or incentive programs, they're just a lot more willing to invest it because they know it's not going to be for one project and then they might not hear from you for a couple of years. So it's really just trying to get that argument out there that this is a worthwhile investment.
We're about out of time. Joe, do you have anything quickly to add?
Yeah, one quick thought. So I actually wrote a blog a while back with the Shakespearean title of "To Revolve or Not to Revolve" that tries to answer this very question based on some conversations with folks. I mean, I'll just quickly rail off some reasons. One is that the whole argument of turning an expense into an investment so that everybody understands that the returns are materializing. Even if your CFO or your facility managers get it, maybe not all stakeholders do. And then, as Matt touched on, it's an opportunity to leverage savings from projects into other projects, and that those other projects don't necessarily have to be additional projects, additional efficiency projects, rather. So what we did at Dartmouth was we actually take 10% of the savings from our facilities' energy efficiency projects, and we shunt those into a community fund that issues what are essentially grants to the community, including students and staff and faculty, to do cool sustainability projects that don't necessarily have a payback. So we're actually leveraging kind of a business arm of the fund into a philanthropy arm of the fund. And that's something that's a lot easier to do when you have a consistent framework for a green revolving fund. You know, they kind of bring the ivory tower down to the community, and they provide an opportunity for stakeholders like students and faculty to sit around a table and decide how the money is going to be used, and it gets you know, more public interest in energy efficiency. And they have predictability and staying power. I mean, committing money to a green revolving fund shows a strong commitment from your institution. And finally, let's face it, I call this the sizzle factor, but green revolving funds are sexy, right? They're something you can show to outside stakeholders and to internal stakeholders to show a concrete monetary commitment to sustainability, and you can drum up some PR buzz around that or whatever you need to do. You know, joining the $1 Billion Green Challenge is a great opportunity for that. But I think they just have, they show a commitment and an emphasis on sustainability that traditional capital investments do not.
Excellent answers. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. But before leaving, I want to give a huge thanks to all of the panelists who put a lot of time into their presentations and did a terrific job presenting. And to SEI for being such a great partner all these years and helping put this webinar together with Joe's talented help. And finally to Jillian, our behind-the-scenes worker, who will be posting all the materials to AASHE's website in a week or so. We'll send you a notice when it's up. And if you have any questions in the meantime, you can email Jillian or me at info@aashe.org. And I want to thank all of you in the audience for taking the time to join us today. And happy Earth Week. You can simply close your screen to exit. Goodbye, everyone.